What's going on, guys? Today I am making a step-by-step video on how to remove a transmission from a 92 to 2000 Honda Civic. I've done this quite a few times now and I've never really made a full how-to video step-by-step transmission removal, so that's what we're gonna do today. Now I'd like to start by saying my car is very aftermarket. It has a lot of stuff done to it. So some steps might be slightly different than if you're doing this on an OEM car. However, I will try my best to cover the differences between the two cars. There's really not that many. You should be able to figure it out, no problem. So your first step, if you don't have an impact gun like that, is you're gonna wanna break your axle nut loose on your wheels. So you're gonna go ahead and while your car is on the ground, pop this center cap off, and then you'll be able to access the axle nut underneath, and just make sure that you can break that loose. You don't have to completely remove your axles to do this job, but I prefer to. So that's the route that I'm gonna take. If you don't wanna remove your axles, you still have to break your lug nuts loose while your car is on the ground. But if you have one of these guns, you can do it while your car is in the air. Your next step is to make sure you have as much room in front of the car as possible, because that's where you're going to be doing most of the work. So I have it pushed almost all the way back to the garage door. And then your next step is to jack up the car pretty high, because you're going to be spending a lot of time underneath and back in this area right here. So you definitely want to get it pretty high off the ground. You can use the front jack point for this. This will let you jack up the front of the car, both wheels off the ground in one go. And that is underneath the front bumper here. And right, my bumper is kind of pushed down from my intercooler piping, but right underneath there, you can see that it's rusty on mine. Might not be on yours, but that's a great spot to jack up the front of your car. Next, go ahead and remove both front wheels. Your lug nuts will most likely be 19mm socket. Next, go ahead and pop your hood. A life hack that most people know about is that you can actually pop your hood a little higher. You're definitely going to want to do that. For this job, you might have to disconnect your window washer fluid. Mine's disconnected because my intercooler piping's there. And then just go ahead and move up your hood prop to this hole up here. The next step is to disconnect your battery. This should just be a 10mm bolt right here, or a 10mm nut. Just loosen that up and pull off your negative terminal. And then you can tuck that down here or something. The next step for you is going to be to remove this splash shield under here. You're going to have two fasteners. You just take a flathead or a trim removal tool and pop them out and remove the splash guard underneath. I don't have it because it was in the way of my intercooler piping, so that's already removed on mine, but you do that on this side. And then you have the same two fasteners on this side. And just for reference, they're these kind of fasteners, which I will show you how to remove in a second because I'm going to remove my bumper. And then you might have some of those underneath holding it on, or some bolts. Just go ahead, if it's still stuck after you remove those, remove the bolts under here. Alright, the next step for me is actually to remove my front bumper. If you have a factory car, you technically don't have to do this to remove the transmission. I have to, because I have to disconnect my intake piping that goes to the intercooler in the front here. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this. The first thing that I'm going to do is remove the grill. For me, the grill is just these 5 clips. For you, if you have an OEM car, the grill is going to be connected to the bumper on the bottom. So if you're taking your bumper off, don't try to take the grill out after removing those 5 clips. Just go ahead and remove those 5 clips. I'm going to remove those and take the grill out. These clips are pretty easy. All you got to do is take a flathead screwdriver and pull this piece up, and the whole clip will pull out. And do that for all 5. So one thing that's actually a really good idea is to label a bag and then put all the parts in that bag that belong in that bag and keep everything organized. That way you don't lose anything and you know exactly where everything goes back. So once you have either your grill out, if you have an aftermarket grill, or just these 5 clips out, if you have an OEM grill, the next step to take your bumper off is to remove these 2 clips right here. And then in the fenders, you're going to have, mine's already fallen apart, but right here, you're going to have a Phillips head screw. Just go ahead and remove that. And then underneath the bumper, there are going to be 2 10mm screws, like one in this area and then one over there, holding it in. Just go ahead and remove those. So I'm going to go ahead and take this thing off. I actually don't know what I have holding it on, but I'll figure it out. So the next step is to remove everything over here that might be in your way. Obviously mine is all aftermarket, but on yours, you are probably going to have an intake box over here. And then if you have a Y7, a D16 Y7, you're gonna have an intake box up here. All you wanna do is just unlatch all 4 latches on that intake box. And then over here, I believe you're just gonna have 1 bolt right here holding that intake box on, or 1 bolt around there somewhere. Take that box out, and then lift the whole entire hose and everything just up and out. If you have a Y8, you're gonna have an intake manifold similar to this one. I believe you'll have a coupler over here. Just go ahead and undo that coupler. Look over here for your intake box. There should be a couple screws holding it in. Undo those screws, undo that coupler, and all of this should pull out as well. You will have like a hose going from here to here, but you'll figure it out as you're doing it. Just remove that whole intake system. On my car, what I need to do is remove this filter and this pipe going to the turbo first, and then once that's out of the way, I can probably just unbolt this hose right here, and then all of this has to come out. So I'm going to slide this vacuum line off the blow-off valve, undo this coupler right there, and then there's another coupler down there that I'm going to pull out, and then the bottom part is in the way of the front transmission mount, so I'm going to remove that as well. So I'm going to be unbolting it from this coupler right here. So I'm going to remove this pipe from here all the way to here. Okay, as you can see, I got all the intake stuff out, and now from this point on, it doesn't necessarily matter what order you do things in up until the point where you pull the transmission out. So essentially, when you pull the transmission out of any car, what you want to do is look for every single way that that transmission is attached to this car. So in this case, we have motor mounts right here. We got one right here in the front. We got one right here over here. And there's also one in the back. And also, there's some little things holding this in place. So you have your starter, which is right here. I'm pretty sure you can actually pull out the transmission with the starter still in, but the starter is plugged in. So I always unplug everything from the starter and remove the starter. The next thing is this ground strap right here going from the body to the transmission. That needs to be removed. There is also the reverse light switch here. If you are OEM, you have this bracket right here that has your O2 sensor plugs mounted on it, so you'll probably have to remove those. You might be able to keep them in. You just have to remove this bolt, the bell housing bolt that's holding this bracket on. I'm not entirely sure. You have your speedometer that's plugged in right there. You have your slave cylinder right here on the front of the transmission, and here is your clutch line. This is also bolted up to the back of the transmission, so that bracket has to be removed. And then underneath the car, there's not too much. There are your axles going from your transmission to your wheels here. So those need to be either just pulled out of the transmission or removed completely. I prefer to remove them completely, so that's what I'm going to show you how to do. And then down here you have your shift linkage and your shift linkage support. Both of those have to be undone so that the transmission can be removed. As you can see right here, I have my downpipe. You probably have either a header or a factory manifold. I recommend removing that. In my case, I'm going to try to avoid removing it because everything's so tight in there that the only way for me to get my downpipe out is for me to remove the turbo manifold and the turbo and the wastegate dump and undo the oil lines. It's a whole big thing, so I'm going to try to avoid that. You don't have to worry about any of that if you're not turbocharged. And even if you are turbocharged, if you don't have AC, you can probably remove your downpipe without doing any of that stuff. There might be more, but that's pretty much all I can think of right now. Obviously, it's also bolted from the transmission into the motor. You have to undo all of that, but that's going to be the last thing that we do. I'm actually going to start on top here, and I'm going to start with one of the most frustrating things, and that is the starter. So the starter essentially has two things plugged into it. You have this little set trigger wire. I don't actually know what both of them do. This is the power. It's covered by this boot that's all ripped up on mine. And then you have either a ground or a trigger wire. I don't actually know. This one just unplugs super easy. It's just one of those little connectors. So go ahead and unplug that. And then this one, slip this boot off and kind of pull it out of the way. And then I believe underneath you either have a 12 or 14 millimeter nut. I will let you know in just a second. Looks like it's 12 millimeter. Just go ahead and bust that loose, take the nut off completely, and then remove the terminal from the starter. Once you have this terminal removed, then go ahead and disconnect these wires from this bracket right here on top of the starter. This one I already have disconnected. It was just sitting there, so that one's good to go. This one, I believe what you do is you stick a flathead screwdriver in the hole and then pry down, or it looks like I might be able to do it with my finger. So there's like a little tab, pry it down, and then pull out. Just like that. Next, you have two 14 millimeter bolts holding the starter on. Those, I'm going to try to show you. So that's one right there. It's on the top part of the starter. You should be able to get to that one relatively easily. And then there is another one. So just going in from right here, down on the bottom side of the starter. You can see it right there. I don't know if you can see my finger. It's right there. And to get to that one, you're going to want a little extension. I like to use Wapple extensions. It makes it a little bit easier for me. And that should be able to get that off. So go ahead and take both of those bolts out, and then you can pull out the starter. Alright, the starter is out. And next, we're just going to go ahead and unplug the speed sensor, which is right here. There's a tab on the top, just squeeze it, and you should be able to unplug that. The next thing that we are going to unplug is the reverse sensor. Here's the reverse sensor plug right here. Go ahead and squeeze that tab right there, and then just pull the two halves apart. That's the actual reverse sensor right there, so just follow that plug to find out where it plugs in and where you have to unplug it. Follow that wire. Next, we're going to disconnect this ground cable. That is a 10 millimeter bolt, so I'm going to go ahead and undo that. The last thing that I can think of on top that has to come off, besides motor mounts, is the slave cylinder. So we have this clutch line right here. There is a 12 millimeter bolt holding on this bracket to the transmission. Yeah, it's this one right here. So we need to undo that 12 millimeter bolt, and then the slave cylinder underneath here. And then we have the slave cylinder down here that has two 12 millimeter bolts. So I'm going to go ahead and take those off. So it looks like all three of the bolts holding this thing on are 12 millimeter. So let's go ahead and pop those off. All right, so now we can go ahead and move this out of the way now that we have everything out. The next thing we need to do is these shifter linkages right here. We need to undo them. So I'm gonna go ahead and undo this side first right here. This is just a 12mm bolt. And then next we need to undo the shift linkage right here. What you're probably going to want to do is just go ahead and pull it back as far as it'll go. And then undo this right here. Just pull this boot forward. And then you're also going to have a clip on there. You can go ahead and pull this clip off. It just slides around and it looks like that. And now what you're going to have here is a pin that you need to punch out. It's 1/4 inch, so I have a 1/4 inch punch right here and a hammer. And then just go ahead and pull this off, just like that. And this can come down too. And you can set those on top of each other. The next step is to remove this bracket right here that connects from the engine to the transmission. It's kind of like a flywheel inspection plate cover. You have two 14mm bolts, one right here and one on the other side right there, and then two 12mm bolts, one up there, as you can see, and one on the other side. And then there's a little black, like thin black inspection plate cover that is held in with a 10mm bolt. My 10mm bolt is missing, so once I take these out, that plate will also just fall out. But in your case, you'll also have to remove that 10mm bolt, which is on the back side over here. So I'm gonna go ahead and try to get these out. The exhaust might be a little bit in the way for me, but I'll see what I can do. Okay, so here's the little piece that was in there. There's the bigger bracket. Those are both out now. The next thing that we're going to do is start working on taking out the axles. So the first thing that I'm going to do is actually drain the transmission. Here is the drain plug for the transmission. It's just got a square in it that's 3/8. So you can take a normal 3/8 drive ratchet and stick it in there and bust that loose. It might be really tight for you. You could put a little bar on it. I have a really long ratchet that I'm going to use, which is super long, but it's 3/8 drive. I'm going to go ahead and stick that in here and bust it loose. There we go. And then once you get it loose, you drain it just like you would engine oil. Looks nice and clean, so that's good, I guess. So next we need to remove this fork so that we can get the axle out. This is a 14mm bolt right there, and then on the bottom we have a 17mm nut, and the head on the other side is also 17mm. You're gonna have to hold that with a wrench while you unbolt that. And then we have a 32mm axle nut right here that needs to come off. And then down here we have a cotter pin and a castle nut right there. And that castle nut is 17 millimeter. We have to take that cotter pin out and undo that castle nut, and then we should be able to pull this whole hub assembly out of the way, hit the axle through, and then we can pull the axle out from the other side. Now the best way to get these ball joints unstuck without ruining the boot is not to use a pickle fork, but to just hit the sides right here with a hammer, that side and this side, and that should bust it loose so that it can be lifted up out of this lower control arm. All right, now we need to do the same exact thing on this side. Pop the drain plug back in over there, and right here, this is the end of what was draining from the transmission. As you can see, that's all metal shavings. So I'm really hoping we didn't do too much damage to this thing. Hopefully that's just like synchros or something that I can replace with a rebuild kit and not my new differential. I don't think that it would be the new differential because it is brass, which looks like synchros, but I guess we'll see when we get this thing taken apart. Alright, I'm going to try my best to show you guys this, but the next step is to pry the axle out from the transmission. So to do that, you're going to want to take a pry bar, and the camera is right in the way of where I need to pry, I feel like. We're going to try our best. So this is going to go right in there. Oh, actually, I might need to lift this thing off the ground more in order to pry these out. Or I might have to try from the top, but normally you just stick a pry bar in there and wedge it out. I'm too close to the ground, so this is not going to work for me. I either need to jack the car up higher or get at it from the top. I'm going to try it from the top. Alright, the first axle is out. I ended up just having to jack up the car a little bit higher, and then I was able to pry it out with this from underneath. But as you can see, it's a decent amount higher now, so we should be able to pry out the other side. Okay, so now I'm pretty sure we're at the point where the only thing holding in this transmission is the bell housing bolts, bolting it to the engine, and the 3 motor mounts, or the 3 transmission mounts, whatever you want to call them. So what I'm going to do first is break loose all of the bell housing bolts, because when the transmission is kind of swinging around in there, when I have it supported, it's going to be hard to break those loose. So we'll go ahead and break those loose right now. I believe they are all 17 millimeter bolts. You are going to have one right here on the back side of the distributor, right there. And then up here, you are going to have one underneath this bracket, right there. One right there. One all the way down there, just beneath this clutch fork right there. And then there's going to be one more on the underside of the engine. Right there, just above where the axle goes in. And then, while I'm down here, I might also just undo these two. Right there, those are motor mount bolts for the transmission. They go into the trans and they bolt into a mount up there, so you're going to want to undo both of those. So while I'm down here, I'm going to loosen up that bell housing bolt and then undo those two right there. The bell housing bolt is 17 millimeter. These two are 19 millimeter. Once I get that bell housing bolt loosened and the other 2 bolts out, I will come over here and I will loosen these remaining 4 bell housing bolts. Okay, now that all the bell housing bolts are loose, the next step is to start removing motor mounts. We need to support the engine, but the engine support beam that I'm going to be using is going to go across the top. You can actually just support your engine with a jack like this with a block of wood on it underneath the oil pan. That'll be plenty for you. The only reason that I'm not doing that is because I already have this beam, and I might need to use my jack on another car while I'm waiting for parts for this, so that I don't have to keep my jack occupied. I'm going to use that beam. However, that beam goes across the top here and might get in the way of me trying to remove some of this stuff. So first, before I support the engine, I am going to remove two of these, so probably this one, and then bust that lower one loose. And then right here, I am going to remove this one, and maybe bust that top one right there loose. And then we'll go ahead and support the engine. Also, these are 17mm bolts and nuts. All right, next we got two more that could be kind of hard to get to with the beam on there. One is the last bolt holding on the rear mount right here. So you actually don't have to take out this T-bracket that's back there. You can leave it bolted into the mount back there. But on the front side of the mount where it bolts to the engine and the transmission, there's a bolt right here. It's 19mm, and that needs to come out. So I'm gonna go ahead and loosen that because it might be kind of hard to get to it with the beam over here. And then also, this piece right here needs to come out because otherwise you're gonna fight with it. With the transmission, it's just gonna be in the way. So I'm also going to loosen up this bolt right here. All right, this next step is to support the engine. If you are doing this on a floor, not on a lift, you can use a jack and just put a board on the jack and put a little bit of weight on the board underneath the oil pan. What I'm going to do is use an engine support bar, and I'm gonna wrap the chain around the distributor here. There are 3 mounting points on the head for the distributor. Seems a little sketchy. I guess you could damage your distributor or your head, but I've done this a million times and I've never had any problems. And if I did that, I guess I have an extra distributor and I have an extra head. So, but that's not gonna happen. Anyway, go ahead and support that now. All right, so this is supported now. I made sure not to go around any wires or coolant lines or anything like that, because there are both of those underneath the distributor, so just be really careful when you do this. And the next thing that we're gonna do is completely remove this front motor mount right there. To do that, we are gonna unbolt this last bolt on the bottom right there. It's a 17mm bolt. And then underneath here, where the actual mount is, right there, you have a 14mm bolt right here and another one on the other side, right there. I'm gonna go ahead and take those 3 bolts out and then we should be good to go. Okay, one mount down, time for the next one. Okay, the second mount is completely disconnected, and now on to the last one. Okay, so this thing is completely disconnected from everything in the car besides the engine. That is the only thing holding the transmission in place right now. And as you can see, actually I don't know if this will move at all because I got this pretty tight. This thing's pretty tight, engine hasn't really moved. But now we need to go ahead and undo the bell housing bolts. I am actually going to lower the car because I'm going to drop the transmission out from the top and I need to be able to reach around it. This isn't necessarily something that you want to do by yourself. Every single time I've done this, it's been me and one other person removing the transmission from underneath the car. Without a transmission jack, it's not that heavy, but it's on a lift, so you have better leverage. I don't want to lay underneath it and bench press it above me. That just sounds really scary to me, and I think that I could get hurt that way. So I'd rather be above the transmission than below it. What I'm going to do is undo the bottom 2 bell housing bolts, and then we're going to lower the car down a little bit so that it's closer to the ground. And I have a 4-wheel dolly that I will roll underneath the car, and we're going to try to pull the transmission off and set it onto that dolly. Okay, so the 2 lower bell housing bolts are out. I got my 4-wheel dolly underneath the transmission here. I'm going to take out the 3 top bell housing bolts, and then I'm going to lower this down a little bit to kind of tilt the engine this way to get the transmission a little bit closer to that dolly. And then I'm just going to reach over the car, grab the transmission from the top, and try to pull it off the engine and set it on that dolly. All of the bell housing bolts are out, and this is about to be scary. I don't exactly know what to do either. Well, the transmission is off and on the dolly, and I didn't do any crazy damage or anything. So the way that worked is I just leaned over the fender here, and I put this arm around the transmission on the underside, and then my left arm I braced against this strut tower and used my bicep to hold the transmission up from the starter hole. So the starter hole, and then wrap your other arm around the transmission, and then I had enough room to drop it down with my left arm, and I was able to carry the weight of it with just my left arm. So it is very heavy. If you're not that strong, maybe don't do this by yourself. But now I need to jack up the car high enough to roll the transmission out from underneath. Well, I was actually able to roll it out of the passenger wheel well, so didn't have to raise the car anymore. I might have to raise the car to put it back in. But that's going to be it for this video, guys. That is how you remove the transmission on a 92 to 2000 Honda Civic. I've done it a whole bunch of times. I'm happy that I was finally able to show you guys a step-by-step process on how to do this in your own garage. I'm really looking forward to figuring out what's wrong with this transmission. I don't know if I really mentioned that much, but it's been making a lot of noises, and obviously there was a ton of oil. There was a ton of metal shavings in the transmission fluid. I'm not really too attached to this transmission. It is an EX transmission, which is nice, but I could probably get another one of those. I am very much attached to my M Factory LSD that's in there, so I'm really hoping that that didn't get damaged in any way, shape, or form from this. So if I need to, I'll buy a new transmission, but I am going to crack this thing open and see what's wrong with it. Hopefully I can just rebuild it. But thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, you can DM me on Instagram as always. If this video was helpful for you, please give it a thumbs up. That'll help me out a whole bunch. I really appreciate all of your support. Peace out.